In the spring of 1895, the most envied woman in New York walked into a lawyer's office and set fire to her own life on purpose. Her name was Alva Vanderbilt. Her husband sat on one of the largest fortunes in the country. When the papers were signed, she walked away with a settlement reported to exceed $10 million, a sum worth several hundred million in today's money. Here is the detail I cannot get out of my head. Before she filed, her own lawyers sat her down and told her not to. Her family told her not to. Everyone who cared about her understood that this one choice could ruin her. She listened to all of it. Then she did it anyway. Because in her world, divorce was not simply rare. It was a social death sentence. A woman who divorced watched her friends disappear and her name drop to a whisper behind gloved hands. Alva knew exactly what it would cost. She filed anyway, and she made her husband pay more than any man in her society had ever paid to end a marriage. What followed was the most expensive society divorce of the Gilded Age. It was also far stranger than anyone admitted out loud. There were whispers that the whole scandal had been staged. There was a mistress in Paris who vanished the moment the trial ended. And there was a woman who lost her entire world in a single year, then pulled every piece of it back into her own hands. This is the story of what she did, why she did it, and the price that came with winning. Chapter 1. The woman who had everything. Before she ruled American society, Alva Erskine Smith was a broke girl from Mobile, Alabama. Her mother was dead. Her family name no longer opened doors. She was born in 1853, the daughter of a cotton merchant whose fortune drained away through her childhood. The family had moved north to New York, chasing the money that kept slipping through their fingers. By her late teens, most of it was gone. She was not pretty, and she knew it. In a world that measured a young woman by her looks and her inheritance, Alva had been handed almost nothing. What she had instead was a will, like a closed fist. A childhood friend named Consuelo Isnaga opened the door that mattered. She introduced Alva to William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the old railroad commodore. In 1875, they married. On paper, it was a rescue. In truth, it was the start of a harder fight. The Vanderbilts owned a giant fortune and almost no respect. The oldest families in New York judged their money crude and new, and they locked the Vanderbilts out of the rooms that granted real standing. So she set out to take those rooms by force. She hired the architect Richard Morris Hunt and raised a French chateau at 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. Then, in 1883, she filled it with 1,200 guests for a costume ball the whole city discussed for weeks. Alva moved through her own ballroom, dressed as a Venetian princess, jewels sewn into the gown. The message was plain. She had not been born into this world, so she would outshine the people who were. The ball was a weapon, and it worked. It forced the reigning queen of society, Caroline Astor, to acknowledge Alva in public for the first time. Then came the rest of the empire. A Newport palace called Marble House, white and gold, reported to cost $11 million and run by 36 servants. A country estate out on Long Island. 3 children. The eldest, a daughter named Consuelo, after the friend who had started everything. Consider what that meant. 2 palaces, one in the city and one by the sea, a staff of dozens, a standing place at every event that counted, and a daughter the whole country watched as the prize of her generation. By the early 1890s, Alva did not simply belong to high society. She ran it. Hostesses copied her menus. Younger women studied how she entered a room. The girl from Mobile who had owned nothing now helped decide what counted as taste in America. She had, by every measure her world respected, arrived. And here is the part I keep turning over. When we hear the word divorce, we picture a woman escaping something unbearable. Alva was not escaping a cramped or miserable life. She was sitting at the top of one she had built across 20 years, stone by stone and invitation by invitation. From the outside, the marriage holding all of this together looked solid. The Vanderbilts were photographed, envied, and copied. Whatever was going wrong between husband and wife stayed behind closed doors, where the public could not see it. That is what made the next move so hard to believe. Every mansion, every friendship, every hard-won seat at the center of things rested on one fact. She was the wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt. Her homes, her income, her invitations, all of it flowed from the marriage. To end it was to put every piece on the table at once. Her lawyers understood this. Her friends understood it too. They told her, in plain words, that a divorce would not set her free. It would wipe her off the map. She picked up the pen anyway. Chapter 2. The Open Secret. In Paris, William Kissam Vanderbilt kept a second life, and he barely troubled to hide it. Her name was Nellie Neustretter. She was American by birth, and by every account, a striking woman. She moved easily through the world of wealthy Paris, where rich men kept mistresses in plain sight. William did exactly that. He set her up in a fine apartment in the city and gave her a house at Deauville, close to the stables where he kept his racehorses. One newspaper claimed he handed her 40,000 francs so openly that friends saw it and begged him to show some discretion. He had no interest in discretion. That was the whole problem. William was, in almost every way, his wife's opposite. Alva was all drive and calculation. He was easy, charming, and far happier among his yachts and his horses than in the social wars she fought on the family's behalf. He had inherited a vast fortune and never once had to struggle for anything. By the early 1890s, he had quietly stepped out of the marriage in all but name, spending more of his time across the Atlantic, where Nellie was waiting. None of this was sudden. They had married in 1875 for practical reasons, and the practical part had always run deeper than the affection. Alva needed a partner in her climb to the top. William wanted to be left alone with his horses. For years, they had simply lived around each other. Nellie was not the cause of the distance between them. She was the proof of it. For Alva, the unbearable part was not the betrayal alone. It was the audience. She had spent 20 years turning the Vanderbilt name into something all of New York envied. Now her own husband was showing off a mistress across Europe, and the talk was drifting home. The women she had beaten to reach the top were whispering behind their fans. In Europe, Neustretter was notorious, the kind of woman whose name travelled. And what was whispered in Paris did not stay in Paris. It crossed the ocean in letters and gossip columns, in the careful half-sentences of people who knew. Alva had built her whole life on controlling what others thought of her. This she could not control. What gets me about William is how little he seemed to feel about any of it. He was not cruel, exactly. He was indifferent, which was somehow worse. A cruel man, at least, notices his wife. William looked straight through her, toward the next race meeting. When the affair could no longer be ignored, William reportedly did not bother to deny it. There was no scene, no plea, no promise to do better. He met his wife's anger with a shrug, and yet Alva did not move to end it right away. In November of 1893, the couple boarded a ship for a long voyage through India. It was a last attempt to save whatever was left. The cruise ran close to 10 months. They travelled side by side for the better part of a year, and it changed nothing at all. There was something strange in the attempt. A failing couple, unable to stand each other at home, locking themselves onto a ship for nearly a year. Perhaps Alva hoped that distance from Nellie would bring William back. Perhaps she only wanted to be able to say she had tried. The ocean cured nothing. If you had asked me how Alva would answer a betrayal like this, I would have guessed fury. What she summoned instead was something colder. She did not want a screaming match. She wanted an exit, and she wanted it entirely on her own terms. By the spring of 1894, somewhere out on that long passage home, she made her decision. She was done. William, for all his carelessness, had handed her exactly what she needed. His affair was no private sorrow. It was public, witnessed, and discussed across 2 continents. And Alva had decided she would rather be a divorced woman than a laughed-at wife. Chapter 3. The Unthinkable Choice. Every lawyer she consulted told her the same thing. Do not do this. They were not being cowardly. They were being truthful. In the New York of the 1890s, divorce was not a quiet matter settled between attorneys. It was a public judgment on a woman's character, and that judgment followed her for life. Her lawyers said so plainly. Her family agreed with them. A divorce, they warned, would not free Alva. It would finish her. Among the families at the very top of New York society, divorce was almost unheard of. A few separations happened quietly, hushed up, and arranged so that no one had to say the word aloud. What Alva intended was the opposite. She would go to court, name her husband, and let the whole country read about it. The law was built to make that nearly impossible. Since 1787, the state of New York had accepted only one reason to end a marriage. Not cruelty, not abandonment, not years of cold contempt, but proof of adultery and nothing else. A wife could be wretched for decades, and the courts would shrug. To win her freedom, she had to prove in open court that her husband had betrayed her, with names and with dates. That rule would shape New York marriages for generations. Not until 1967 would the state finally recognize any other grounds. That one requirement is what made the whole process so cruel. To free herself, Alva would have to put her own humiliation on the public record. She would have to let her lawyers set out William's affair in front of a judge. The open arrangement abroad entered as evidence. The very gossip that had wounded her would now do its work in court. There was no dignified version of this. The law did not allow one. There was a sharper twist buried in the statute. New York punished the guilty party. The innocent spouse walked away free to marry again. The one the court found at fault was forbidden to remarry, not while the wronged partner still lived. The law was written to shame the sinner and shield the betrayed. And in this marriage, the sinner was William. I find a kind of cold brilliance in what she did next. The same law that trapped most unhappy wives could, in her exact case, be turned into a weapon. Alva did not need a kinder statute. She needed a guilty husband, and she had one. So she gave the instruction. Sometime in 1894, against the advice of every person she trusted, Alva told her lawyers to proceed. What followed was not quick or simple. The separation was negotiated point by point, carefully and at length, by attorneys on both sides. In March of 1895, a New York court granted Alva Vanderbilt an absolute divorce. The decree handed her full custody of all 3 children. It confirmed her right to marry again. And it placed William where the law placed every guilty husband, branded at fault, forbidden to remarry while his former wife lived. Each piece of that decree mattered. Custody was not automatic, and a mother who lost it could lose her children for good. Alva kept all 3. The right to remarry mattered as well, For a woman still in her early 40s, taken together, it was as complete a win as the law could give her. What stays with me is the sheer nerve of it. This was not a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. This was a woman who sat at the very center of American society, choosing to drag her private misery through a courtroom. Women of her rank were supposed to endure in silence. Alva refused. By the time the papers were signed, it was done. At 42 years old, she was no longer Mrs. William Kissam Vanderbilt. She was a divorced woman who had outwitted a brutally strict divorce law and won. She had her children, she had her freedom, and she had taken them by doing the one thing nobody believed she would dare. Chapter 4. Was it even real? Here is the question that has trailed this divorce for more than 100 years. What if William wanted it? On the surface, the story could not be simpler. A husband strays, a wife catches him. She makes him answer for it in a courtroom. That is the version the newspapers printed, and it is the version most people have believed ever since. But sit with the details for a moment, and the simple story begins to wobble. Start with the strangest part. William did not fight the divorce. A man of his wealth could have hired the finest lawyers money could buy. He could have denied everything, dragged the case out for years, and buried his wife in expense and delay. He did none of it. He let the accusation stand and barely raised a hand to defend his own name. A husband publicly accused of betrayal was expected to protest, if only for appearances. His name, his standing among other men, all of it was on the line. William let the charge land without a word. For a proud man in a proud age, that silence said something. Then there is the matter of the mistress. Nellie Neustretter had been the heart of the whole case, the living proof of William's guilt. And the instant the trial ended, she was gone. The affair that had supposedly broken a marriage simply stopped, almost on schedule, the moment it had served its purpose. To the people watching at the time, none of this fit together. And so a theory began to spread through the drawing rooms of New York. What if the affair had been arranged from the start? What if William, desperate to be free of a marriage he no longer wanted, had quietly paid a woman to play the role of his mistress? It would have handed Alva the grounds she needed, and handed William the exit he craved, all without him ever filing for divorce himself. I want to be careful here, because this is the point where a good story can outrun the evidence. There is no proof that the divorce was staged. There never was. It is a rumor, born from suspicious timing and a husband who behaved strangely, but it was a rumor that serious people took seriously. One of those people was Henry James. The novelist took a scenario almost identical to this one and built a short story around it. In his version, a rich man strikes a quiet bargain with a woman who has no social standing and no name to protect, so that he can be divorced on her account, while his real affections lie elsewhere. Whether James had the Vanderbilts directly in mind, the resemblance is hard to miss. The idea of a staged divorce was so much in the air that it found its way into the fiction of the age. And yet the tidy version of the theory has a hole in it. The formal grounds, by some accounts, named more than one woman. Alongside Neustretter, the charge is said to have included a titled Englishwoman, the Duchess of Manchester. If William had simply hired a single fake mistress, why would a second name ever appear? So we are left with a knot that will not come undone. Maybe William was a careless man who finally got caught. Maybe he was a calculating one buying his own freedom. And it is just as possible that Alva, who missed almost nothing, understood the arrangement and let it run because it gave her exactly what she wanted. The real twist, to my mind, is this. In the end, it may not matter which version is true, real or staged. the outcome was the same. Alva walked away with her freedom and her children. William walked away with his. The story worked out for everyone whose name we still remember. Everyone, that is, except the woman at the center of it. Nellie Newstretter had been the name that made the whole thing possible, the proof, the scandal, the key that turned the lock. And then she was simply finished with. She walks out of the record the moment the trial ends, and history barely bothers to note where she went. Chapter 5. The Price of Freedom. $10 million. That is the figure that made this divorce famous, the number that turned a private collapse into a national sensation. When the terms were reported, the sum alone was enough to stop readers cold. $10 million in 1895 would be worth more than $300 million in our own time. Numbers that large lose their meaning, so try this. An ordinary American worker in that era might earn a few $100s in a year. Set against that wage, Alva's settlement was the equivalent of tens of thousands of years of labor. It could have built a dozen palaces like the ones she lived in and still left a fortune to spare. And the lump sum was only the start of it. The agreement reportedly gave her far more than a single payment. On top of the lump sum came an income said to reach $100,000 a year, arriving whether she remarried or not. She kept a share of the great family houses. She kept full custody of the 3 children. And she held on to the Vanderbilt name itself, which still opened any door in America. There was one more piece, though it was not really a prize at all. The White Palace at Newport, Marble House, was already hers. William had deeded it to her years before, in her own name. So part of what the world saw as a generous settlement was simply Alva keeping a house she had owned all along. Taken together, it was very likely the largest divorce settlement the country had seen up to that point. The newspapers treated it as a kind of record, a public price tag fixed to a broken marriage. And in a way, that is exactly what it was. The size of the payment told anyone who could read just how badly the court believed Alva had been wronged. But here is where that famous number starts to mislead. For William, $10 million was not ruin. It was not even a real wound. The Vanderbilt money came from the railroads the old Commodore had built, a fortune counted in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It ran so deep that a payment like this barely registered. He handed over the largest settlement anyone had seen, and his wealth hardly noticed it was gone. The contrast says everything about the distance between them. To the public, the figure was proof of a deep wrong, a husband made to pay dearly. To William, it was a fair price for his freedom, paid and soon forgotten. The same $10 million meant disaster to the popular imagination and a rounding error to the man who signed it away. I have to be honest here. The $10 million is the least interesting thing about this divorce. We remember the number because numbers are easy to remember. But the number is not what changed Alva's life. So what did the money actually buy her? Not comfort. She had been rich for 20 years. In her world, a married woman's money was rarely truly her own. It moved through her husband on his goodwill. What the settlement bought Alva was a way out of that arrangement for good. Her wealth was now hers alone. No man controlled it. No man could threaten to cut her off. She could spend on what she pleased and walk away from anyone who displeased her. If you ask me what she truly bought that day, it was not comfort, and it was not even the houses. It was the right to never again depend on a man's goodwill. For the rest of her long life, she would spend her own money, on her own terms, answering to no one. That was the real settlement. The $10 million was just the part the newspapers could count. Chapter 6. Cast Out. the invitations stopped first. For 20 years, Alva Vanderbilt's calendar had been the fullest in New York. Now the cards that once flooded her hall slowed to a trickle, then to nothing at all. The dinners went on without her. The Newport season filled with the same faces as always, missing only one. She had not left town. She had simply been erased from it. This was the price every advisor had warned her about, and it came exactly as promised. Polite society did not punish a divorced woman with shouting. It punished her with absence. Calling cards went unreturned. Old friends looked through her on the street. Hostesses who had once begged for her presence now found gentle reasons she could not be included. There was no single moment of banishment, only 1,000 small doors closing, one after another. In that world, there was even a name for the weapon used against her. To cut someone was to look straight at them and refuse to admit they existed. It was a small, deliberate cruelty, performed in public so that others would see it and follow suit. Alva, who had once helped decide who received this treatment, was now on the wrong end of it. Some of the sharpest snubs came from women who owed her their own positions. She had opened doors for them, lent them her glamour, pulled them into the rooms that mattered. When the scandal broke, they were among the first to step away. Gratitude, Alva learned, did not survive a divorce decree. The bitter part was that she had built this world with her own hands. She was the one who had stormed the gates of old New York and forced its queen to receive her. She had helped write the rules of who belonged and who did not. Now those same rules were turned against her, and the gates she had battered open were barred from the inside. Her wealth could not save her. That is the detail people find hardest to credit. She was as rich as almost any woman in the country, with houses and servants and money entirely her own. But rank and riches were never the same currency. A fortune could buy a grand house on the Newport cliffs. It could not buy back a seat at a table that had voted to remove you. A Newport summer went on without her. Yachts filled the harbour as they always had. Balls lit the cliffs night after night. And Alva sat inside her own great house just down the road, close enough to hear the music, shut out of all of it. She had built the showpiece of the avenue and could not get herself invited to the party next door. If there is a part of this story I would not have survived, it is this one. The loneliness. These were not strangers who turned from her. They were the people she had dined with for 2 decades, whose children had grown up alongside her own. The women she had stood beside at 100 weddings now found somewhere else to look. For someone who had spent her whole life at the center of the room, the quiet must have been its own kind of punishment. I do not think even Alva expected the sheer unfairness of it. William, the man who had actually strayed, lost almost nothing. He kept his clubs. He kept his friends. He was welcomed everywhere he had always been welcomed. Society saved its full punishment for the wife, the wronged party, the one who had dared to say out loud that the marriage was over. A man could betray his wife and remain a gentleman. A woman could be betrayed and become a scandal. None of it was fair, and all of it held. And so the real verdict of the affair was not written in money at all. It was written in silence. Alva had walked into this with her eyes wide open. She had been told exactly what it would cost, and she had paid every cent of it. She had her children. She had her independence. What she did not have, in the long, quiet months that followed, was a single old friend left to sit beside her. Chapter 7. The comeback she had already planned. While society was busy burying her, Alva was already digging her way out. This is the part the story of her fall leaves out. The exile and the comeback were not 2 separate seasons of her life. They overlapped. even as the cards stopped arriving and the old friends turned their backs. Alva was quietly setting the pieces of her return in place. She had never once intended to stay buried. Her first move was her daughter. In November of 1895, only months after the divorce, her daughter Consuelo became the Duchess of Marlborough. The wedding stopped the country. It was a match Alva had pushed hard to make, and the girl had little say in it, but the detail that mattered to Alva was the title. Overnight, a disgraced divorcee had become the mother of an English duchess. You could close your door to a fallen woman. It was far harder to close it to the mother of her grace. A title like that did not only lift Consuelo, it lifted her mother. The very women who had snubbed Alva now had to reckon with the fact that her daughter outranked nearly every one of them. Her second move was bolder still. 2 months later, in January of 1896, Alva married again. The man was Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, and the choice was deliberate. He was rich, charming, and well-connected, the son of a great American banking family. He was also William's former close friend. Marrying him was part love match and part quiet revenge, a way of telling her old world exactly what she thought of it. New York was scandalized all over again. In that age, 2 divorced people marrying each other was close to unthinkable, and the disapproval had teeth. No priest or minister in the city would agree to perform the ceremony. In the end, Alva had to turn to the mayor himself, William Strong, who married the couple in a civil service. The head of a great city, pressed into duty as a wedding officiant because the church would not have them. It was a humiliation dressed up as a solution, and Alva did not care in the slightest. She wanted the marriage, and she got it. And here the old whispers came back. The same people who had wondered whether the divorce was staged now wondered something sharper. What if Alva and Belmont had been drawn together long before the marriage ended? What if the real story had never been William's wandering, but Alva's own heart? There is no proof of it. But the speed of the remarriage made the question impossible to ignore. A woman supposedly ruined by divorce had a duke in the family and a new husband at her side inside of a single year. The 2 marriages did different work, and together they did everything. The duke gave Alva borrowed grandeur, a daughter who outranked the people who had shut her out. The Belmont match gave her a powerful new family to stand behind her. One union bought prestige, the other bought protection. Between them, they rebuilt in months what the divorce had pulled down. With Belmont came a new house, Belcourt, a vast Newport mansion raised by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect behind her first great homes. From inside it, Alva set about the patient work of rebuilding the standing she had lost. I have to hand it to her. Most people, after the public humiliation she had just endured, would have retreated into a quiet life. Alva did the reverse. She treated her own ruin as a problem to be engineered around, and she engineered it well. If I am honest, I cannot decide whether to admire her or be unnerved by her. The fall was real. The loneliness was real. But Alva never seemed to experience any of it as the end of her story. To her, it was a setback in a longer campaign, and campaigns could be turned around. Within roughly a year of the decree, she had a duchess for a daughter, a new husband, and a new house from which to mount her return. The woman they had cast out had rebuilt her position in a single year. She had not begged for forgiveness, and she had not waited for the old door to reopen. Instead, she built a new door, grander than the one that had closed, and dared society to refuse her this time. Chapter 8. The Man Who Beat the Verdict. While Alva fought to rebuild her world in New York, William did the simplest thing imaginable. He left. He gathered up his life and crossed the Atlantic, settling into the country he had always preferred to his wife's battlefield. In France, William Kissam Vanderbilt finally got the existence he had wanted all along. No campaigns for status, no exhausting marriage, no one to answer to. Just horses, open country, and quiet. It was the life he should have had from the start. He built a chateau in Normandy and poured himself into the thing he loved most, thoroughbred horses. Near the coast at Deauville, he founded a great racing and breeding stable, the Haras du Quesnay. It was no rich man's hobby. He spared no expense, brought in fine bloodlines, and within a few years, the Quesnay name was winning important French races. The operation earned the respect of horsemen who cared nothing for his American scandals. He had become a fixture of the French turf, an American who had earned his place among Europe's serious owners. This was the man he had always been, underneath the Vanderbilt name. Back in New York, he had drifted through his own marriage, content only when he was near a racetrack or a harbor, while his wife fought her endless battles for status. France let him drop the act entirely. He was not a society husband. He was a horseman, and now he could simply be one. Then came the part that should not have been possible. The divorce decree had branded William the guilty party, and the label carried a penalty. He was forbidden to remarry while Alva still lived, and Alva would live for nearly 40 more years. On paper, he was sentenced to stay single for most of his life, so he ignored the sentence. In 1903, he married Anne Harriman, a respected widow, and the New York courts could do nothing about it. A judgment handed down in Manhattan had no power over a man who lived in France. By every sign, the second marriage suited him far better than the first. Anne Harriman was poised, independent, and tied to old American families of her own. She and William stayed together until the end of his life, a calm partnership with none of the friction that had defined his years with Alva. It was, in its quiet way, everything his first marriage had not been. Something about this still rankles me. Of the two people in this story, it was William, the man who strayed, the one the court condemned, who walked away with the gentlest fate. He let go of the marriage that had bored him, kept the bulk of his money, and settled into the calm life he had always craved. Best of all, he married a woman he had actually chosen. He divided his years between France and America, between his racing stable and his yacht, answerable to no one and bored by nothing. He had the money to buy whatever caught his eye and the freedom to ignore whatever did not. By any ordinary measure, it was a charmed existence. The contrast is hard to miss. Alva had to fight a long campaign to rebuild everything the divorce took from her. William bought a horse farm and let the whole affair fade behind him. The verdict was supposed to be his punishment. It landed on him like a feather. To my eye, the clearest measure of how little the verdict touched him is the way he ended. William Kissam Vanderbilt died in 1920 in France, still enormously rich and still surrounded by the horses he loved. He had outlasted the scandal by a quarter of a century. The headlines that once shouted his name had long since gone quiet, and he had spent those years living exactly as he pleased. The most expensive divorce of the Gilded Age had cost William Vanderbilt a fortune. By every account, he could not have cared less. Chapter 9. The Floodgates. Alva's divorce was the one the whole country remembered. But she was not the only woman walking out of a marriage in those years. She was simply the most famous. Something was shifting across America in those years, quietly at first, and then in plain view. The thing that had nearly destroyed Alva, the thing that was supposed to be unthinkable for a woman of her rank, was slowly becoming, for a certain kind of American, almost ordinary. Alva did not start that change, but she became its most visible face. The reason it had been so hard for so long was the law. Across most of the country, divorce was punishingly difficult to obtain. Some states allowed it only in the narrowest circumstances. A few refused to grant it at all. For an unhappy husband or wife, the law often offered no way out. So those with money did what people with money tend to do. They went looking for a loophole, and they found one out west. In the young state of South Dakota, the divorce laws were unusually loose, a leftover from frontier days when settlers came and went, and the law could not afford to be fussy. A person needed only 90 days in the state to use its courts, and the accepted grounds were broad. Word traveled fast. Soon a steady stream of unhappy spouses was boarding trains for Sioux Falls. The small prairie city sat at the crossing of several rail lines, which made it easy to reach from the east. They settled in at a comfortable hotel called the Cataract House, paying a few dollars a day to live in style while they waited out their 90 days. The newspapers gave the whole spectacle a name. They called it the Divorce Colony. The residents of the colony joked that they were serving a sentence, counting down the days until the court would set them free. So many came that Sioux Falls filled with lawyers competing for their business. The arrivals outraged the locals. The clergy thundered against them, and when the state tried to slow the tide by stretching the residency requirement to 6 months, the divorce seekers simply unpacked and stayed 6 months instead. I do not want to overstate any one woman's role here, including Alva's. But the pattern underneath the gossip is striking. For most of history, divorce had been a rich man's tool. He had the money and the influence to bend the law, while a wife who left often had nowhere to go and nothing of her own. So women stayed. By the 1890s, that was breaking down. More and more of the travelers on those westbound trains were women, deciding for themselves that a miserable marriage did not have to last a lifetime. Alva fit that pattern and also stood apart from it. She never needed the divorce colony. She had what the New York court required and the money to fight her case at home, in the open. Most women had neither, which is why they made the long, lonely trip to a prairie hotel 1,000 miles from home. What Alva had that the quiet Sioux Falls divorces did not was the spotlight. Her case played out on every front page in the country, and the spotlight did something the anonymous prairie divorces could not. It forced the whole country to look. Here was a woman near the very top of society, divorcing in full public view, and not disappearing afterward. People who would never have read a word about Sioux Falls read every word about Alva Vanderbilt. Whether she meant to or not, she made the unthinkable visible. The floodgates did not open in a single day, and they did not open because of one divorce. They had been creaking for years before Alva ever filed. But of all the people pouring through them, she was the one the country watched. The stigma that had nearly buried her slowly faded for the women who came after. What had meant social ruin in 1895 became, within a generation, a manageable embarrassment, and finally, not much of anything at all. If I take anything from this chapter, it is the strange unfairness of being early. Alva paid the full price of divorcing in public. The women who followed paid less, precisely because she had gone first and lived through it. Chapter 10. Failure is impossible. Of all the things Alva Vanderbilt might have become in her later years, no one predicted this. The woman who had spent 2 decades conquering ballrooms turned into a force in the long fight for women's right to vote. When Oliver Belmont died in 1908, Alva was widowed for the second time. She was in her 50s, immensely rich, and answerable to no one. A woman in her position was expected to fade gracefully into charity work and grandchildren. Alva did nothing of the kind. She found a cause to pour herself into, and she put the full weight of her money and her will behind it. She became a suffragist. Her own life had taught her the lesson. She had felt, firsthand, how completely a woman's fate could hinge on a husband's goodwill and a man's law. She had escaped that trap with money and nerve that most women would never have. And she did not fight quietly. Alva did everything at full volume. In 1909, she founded her own organization, the Political Equality Association, to push for a woman's right to vote. A few years later, she became a major force behind the National Woman's Party, the militant wing of the movement, led by the young organizer Alice Paul. In 1917, those women did something no one had dared before. They marched to the gates of the White House and stood there in silence, day after day, holding their banners while the country argued and the police circled. Some of them went to jail for it and endured real brutality there. This was not polite charity work. It was the front line of a fight, and it was Alva's money that helped keep them on that sidewalk. She put her famous houses to work as well. Marble House, the Newport Palace she had built as a monument to her own social ambition, was thrown open for the cause. In 1914, she gathered suffrage leaders there for a grand conference and opened the house to paying visitors to raise money. The mansion, built to awe the snobs of high society, now helped fund a movement to change the country. Here is what I cannot help admiring. It was the same Alva all along. The drive, the money, the flat refusal to lose, the instinct for spectacle. Every tool she had once used to climb to the top of society, she now turned toward winning women the vote. She did not become a new person in her old age. She simply found a cause big enough for her ferocity. But there is a shadow across this story, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. In 1921, Alva took the witness stand in a courtroom. The proceedings concerned her daughter Consuelo and the long-ago marriage to the Duke of Marlborough. Under oath, the great champion of women's freedom said it plainly. She had held absolute power over her daughter. The girl had been given no real choice, and the marriage had gone ahead because Alva willed it. I have turned that fact over many times, and I still do not know what to do with it. The woman fighting, as hard as anyone in the country, for a woman's right to govern her own life, had once denied her own daughter that exact right. Both things were true. The same person held both. I do not think it cancels what she did for millions of other women. I do not think it can be waved away either. It simply sits there, the contradiction at the center of her, and she carried it to the end. She never stopped. The vote came in 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, and Alva lived to see the cause she had given her last years to become the law of the land. She went on to lead the National Woman's Party in the years that followed. When she died in 1933, her funeral was exactly the statement you would expect of her. The pallbearers were women. The banners carried the slogans of the movement, and over it all hung 3 words borrowed from Susan B. Anthony, words that might as well have been her own. Failure is impossible. Conclusion: the real price. We started with a number, $10 million, the price of the most expensive divorce of the Gilded Age. But by now I hope it is clear that the money was never the real story. What Alva Vanderbilt discovered in 1895 was not wealth. She already had that. What she discovered was power, the full and frightening extent of her own. She learned that she could take the rules written to trap her and turn them to her own ends. She learned that she could lose everything and build it back. Once a person learns that about themselves, they rarely forget it. That same power runs through every part of her story, for better and for worse. It is the power that detonated her marriage and bent a daughter to her will. It is the power that hauled her back from ruin, and that, in the end, helped win millions of American women the right to vote. The will was always the same, only the target changed. It is tempting to make her a hero, and just as tempting to make her a villain. She was neither, and she was both. She freed herself, and she trapped her daughter. She broke the rules for her own gain, and then broke them again for a cause far larger than herself. When American women cast their first votes under the 19th Amendment, Alva Belmont's money and nerve were part of what had made it possible. Today, a monument in Washington still carries her married name, honoring the fight she helped fund. It is a strange and fitting legacy for a woman the world once tried to erase. The most expensive divorce of the Gilded Age cost a fortune. But what it truly bought, in the end, was the right of one woman to decide her own life. Alva spent the rest of hers making sure other women could decide theirs too.